The Kindred wasn't just a horror film. It felt like a biological accident that somehow made it onto a movie screen. Released in the late 1980s when audiences still expected monsters to feel fictional, this film crossed a line many didn't even realize existed. Its horrors didn't look imagined. They looked clinical, surgical, disturbingly possible. Viewers weren't reacting to jump scares or cheap shocks. They were recoiling from images that felt uncomfortably close to real medical science. Some scenes were considered so raw, so anatomically convincing, that they drew the attention of censors not for violence, but for realism. So why did this film provoke such unease? And what exactly made The Kindred feel less like entertainment and more like evidence? These are 20 weird facts you didn't know about The Kindred. 1987. 1. When The Kindred was conceived, it wasn't designed to scare audiences in the conventional horror sense. The filmmakers were far more interested in discomfort than terror. Instead of ghosts or supernatural forces, the story leaned heavily into biological plausibility, a choice that immediately set it apart from most late 1980s genre films. The central horror comes from the idea that everything on screen could in theory exist within the boundaries of real-world genetics and medical experimentation. That decision shaped the film's entire visual language. The creatures weren't exaggerated monsters with theatrical flair. They were misshapen, underdeveloped, and unsettling in ways that echoed real congenital abnormalities. To achieve this effect, the production relied on practical makeup techniques inspired by medical photography rather than fantasy art. The prosthetics emphasized asymmetry, exposed tissue, and incomplete forms details that felt closer to pathology textbooks than Hollywood creature design. This realism is exactly what made many viewers uneasy. Test audiences reportedly struggled to categorize what they were seeing. It didn't feel fake enough to be safely enjoyed as fiction, yet it wasn't presented as documentary either. That ambiguity created a visceral reaction few horror films managed to provoke at the time. Ironically, this commitment to realism worked against the movie's reception, while slashers thrived on stylization and exaggeration. The Kindred asked audiences to confront something far more intimate, the fragility of the human body when science crosses ethical boundaries. For some viewers, the film felt less like escapism and more like a violation of an unspoken contract between cinema and comfort. It wasn't just frightening, it was invasive. And that may explain why many people didn't walk away terrified, but disturbed in a way they couldn't easily explain. 2. One of the most controversial aspects of The Kindred emerged during its post-production phase, when early cuts of the film were screened for distributors and ratings boards. Unlike typical censorship cases involving excessive gore or violence, the concerns raised here were unusually specific. Certain scenes were flagged not because they were bloody, but because they resembled real medical procedures too closely. The imagery evoked operating rooms, surgical exposure, and biological experimentation with a level of detail that unsettled reviewers tasked with classification. What made this particularly problematic was intent. The filmmakers hadn't aimed for shock value through extremity. They were chasing authenticity. As a result, several sequences were deemed inappropriate simply because they felt too real. The line between fiction and clinical reality had blurred to the point where it became uncomfortable for institutional gatekeepers. Some cuts were requested to reduce lingering shots or alter pacing, not to hide violence, but to distance the audience emotionally from what they were seeing. This reaction placed The Kindred in a strange position within the horror landscape. Films could get away with outrageous fantasy violence. Yet here was a movie facing resistance for being restrained and plausible. The censorship didn't come with loud controversy or public outrage. Instead, it quietly reshaped the final version, contributing to the film's fragmented reputation. Many viewers sensed something missing without knowing why. The irony is that these interventions may have amplified the film's mystique. Knowing that scenes were altered because they felt medically authentic only reinforced the sense that the Kindred had touched something sensitive. It wasn't banned, and it wasn't infamous, but it was quietly contained, as if everyone involved wanted to acknowledge its power without fully confronting it. 3. Despite its disturbing concepts, The Kindred arrived at a moment when audiences were already saturated with horror. The late 1980s were dominated by familiar formulas, masked killers, supernatural franchises, and increasingly self-aware genre tropes. Against that backdrop, a slow, biology-driven horror film struggled to find its audience. Marketing materials failed to communicate what made the movie different, often presenting it as a conventional creature feature, rather than the unsettling ethical nightmare it actually was. This mismatch had consequences. Viewers expecting fast-paced scares were caught off guard by the film's deliberate tone and clinical atmosphere. Meanwhile, audiences who might have appreciated its themes were unlikely to be drawn in by posters that promised something more generic. As a result, The Kindred slipped through the cracks, neither embraced nor outright rejected, just quietly ignored. Over time, this obscurity became part of its identity. The film wasn't discussed as a failure or a cult success. It simply faded from conversation. Yet those who encountered it later often reported a lingering sense of unease, as if the movie had planted an idea rather than delivered a thrill. Its horror aged differently, growing more relevant as real-world genetic science advanced. In retrospect, The Kindred may have been ahead of its time. It asked questions audiences weren't ready to face, wrapped in imagery that refused to soften its message. That refusal cost it mainstream recognition, but it also ensured the film would never feel harmless. Even forgotten, it remains quietly unsettling, waiting for viewers willing to sit with discomfort rather than escape from it. 4. What truly separates The Kindred from most horror films of its era is how little emotional distance it gives the audience. Many genre movies rely on irony, humor, or spectacle to soften their impact. This film does the opposite. Its tone remains consistently clinical, almost indifferent, as if the camera itself is observing rather than judging. That detachment makes the disturbing elements harder to dismiss. There is no musical cue telling you when to relax, no exaggerated framing to remind you it's just a movie. Everything unfolds with an unsettling matter-of-factness. This approach mirrors the way real scientific documentation often feels cold, precise, and emotionally neutral. By adopting that perspective, the film invites viewers into a space where moral discomfort isn't highlighted, but quietly implied. You're not told something is wrong. You're expected to realize it on your own. That expectation places a subtle burden on the audience, forcing them to engage intellectually rather than react instinctively. For some viewers, this made the film exhausting rather than entertaining. Without the release valve of conventional horror beats, the tension accumulates slowly and never fully dissipates. Scenes linger just long enough to feel intrusive, then move on without explanation. This pacing frustrated those looking for catharsis, but it deeply affected viewers sensitive to implication and atmosphere. In hindsight, this stylistic choice explains why The Kindred still feels uncomfortable decades later. Its horror isn't tied to trends or dated effects. It's embedded in perspective. The film doesn't scream for attention, it watches records and moves on. And that quiet indifference may be more disturbing than any explicit act it shows. 5. The film's treatment of science reflects a broader cultural anxiety that was beginning to surface in the late 1980s. Genetic research was advancing rapidly, but public understanding lagged behind, creating a fertile ground for fear and speculation. The Kindred taps into that unease without resorting to exaggerated science fiction. Instead, it presents experimentation as something incremental and almost mundane, an accumulation of small, ethical compromises, rather than a single dramatic transgression. This framing is crucial. The horror doesn't come from a mad scientist archetype, but from the normalization of questionable decisions. Characters rarely stop to ask whether they should proceed. They focus on whether they can. That mindset feels disturbingly familiar, especially in hindsight, as real-world debates around genetic engineering and bioethics have grown more complex. By avoiding clear villains, the film shifts responsibility onto systems rather than individuals. Institutions, processes, and unchallenged assumptions become the true antagonists. This makes the story harder to resolve emotionally because there's no single figure to blame or defeat. The consequences simply exist, indifferent to intent. At the time of its release, this nuance may have been overlooked. Audiences often expect horror to provide moral clarity, even if it's crude. The Kindred refused to do that, offering instead a scenario where curiosity and progress quietly override caution. That refusal may have limited its appeal, but it also gave the film a relevance that has only intensified with time. 6. Another reason the Kindred struggled to connect with audiences lies in how it handles revelation. Most horror films build toward a clear unveiling. The monster revealed the truth, exposed the mystery explained. Here, information emerges in fragments, often without emphasis. Critical details appear casually embedded in dialogue or background moments that are easy to miss. The film trusts viewers to pay attention, and it doesn't slow down to ensure they do. This narrative restraint can feel alienating. Viewers accustomed to being guided step by step may find themselves disoriented, unsure of what they're meant to focus on. Yet that disorientation mirrors the character's own experiences. Knowledge arrives, incomplete context is lacking, and understanding always feels one step behind events. The audience shares that unease, not through spectacle, but through uncertainty. This storytelling choice likely contributed to the film's muted impact on release. Without a strong narrative handhold, many viewers walked away confused rather than intrigued. Confusion rarely translates into word-of-mouth success, especially in a crowded genre market. But for those willing to rewatch and reassemble the pieces, the film reveals a carefully controlled structure beneath its surface ambiguity. In that sense, The Kindred rewards patience more than enthusiasm. It doesn't announce its ideas, it hides them in plain sight. And the unsettling realization, often reached too late, is that the film never wanted to be understood easily. It wanted to feel unresolved, much like the scientific questions it quietly raises. 7. The creature effects in The Kindred weren't meant to impress. They were meant to unsettle on a subconscious level. Unlike many horror films of the era that showcase their practical effects as spectacle, this film often keeps its most disturbing visuals partially obscured or framed in unflattering angles. The camera avoids heroic lighting and dramatic reveals, choosing instead harsh illumination that emphasizes texture and imperfection. Skin looks fragile. Shapes feel incomplete. Nothing appears designed to be admired. This approach aligns closely with how the human brain reacts to unfamiliar biology. We are instinctively disturbed not by monsters that look powerful, but by bodies that look wrong, forms that suggest illness, deformity, or failed development. The effects team leaned into that instinct, drawing inspiration from real anatomical irregularities rather than fantasy creatures. As a result, the horror bypasses imagination and lands somewhere deeper, triggering discomfort that feels involuntary. What's striking is how little the film explains these visuals. There's no long exposition justifying what you're seeing, no attempt to rationalize every abnormality. The images simply exist, forcing the viewer to sit with them. That lack of explanation denies the audience emotional closure, leaving unease unresolved. Over time, this restraint has aged better than excess. While many effects-heavy films from the same period now feel dated or artificial, The Kindred still provokes a reaction because it never tried to dazzle. It aimed for something quieter and more invasive. A reminder that the most disturbing imagery doesn't shout. It lingers. 8. The performances in The Kindred contribute significantly to its unsettling tone, largely because they resist melodrama. Characters rarely react with the exaggerated fear typical of horror cinema. Instead, their responses are muted, hesitant, and often delayed. Shock is processed slowly, as if disbelief comes before panic. This choice gives the impression that the characters themselves are struggling to accept what they're witnessing, not just reacting to it. This subdued acting style reinforces the film's clinical atmosphere. Emotions are present, but restrained, as though everyone is operating under an unspoken rule, not to acknowledge how disturbing things have become. That restraint feels realistic. In real crises, people often underreact before they overreact, if they ever do. The film captures that awkward middle ground with uncomfortable accuracy. For some viewers, this made the characters seem distant or unlikable. Horror audiences often rely on emotional cues to know how to feel. And The Kindred offers very few. But that emotional ambiguity is deliberate. By refusing to guide empathy too clearly, the film places the viewer in an observational role rather than an emotional one. This distance can feel alienating, but it also deepens the horror. Without exaggerated reactions, the abnormal becomes normalized, at least temporarily. And that normalization may be the most unsettling idea of all, that people can adapt to almost anything, even when they shouldn't. 9. Perhaps the most overlooked aspect of The Kindred is how little it cares about providing reassurance. Many horror films, even bleak ones, offer some form of moral or narrative balance by the end. Evil is contained, truth is revealed, or order is restored. The Kindred resists that impulse. Its conclusion doesn't resolve the discomfort it creates. It merely stops observing it. This lack of closure can feel unsatisfying, especially for first-time viewers. But it's also consistent with the film's thematic core. Scientific experimentation, once begun, doesn't neatly conclude when a story ends. Consequences ripple outward, often unseen and unresolved. By refusing a clean ending, the film mirrors that reality. At the time of release, this may have been interpreted as weakness or indecision. Audiences often expect horror to deliver a final emotional payoff, even if it's grim. The Kindred denies that release, leaving viewers with questions rather than answers. In retrospect, that denial feels intentional. The film doesn't want to comfort or instruct, it wants to linger in uncertainty. And long after the credits roll, that uncertainty remains quietly unsettling, as if the story never truly finished, only stopped being recorded. 10. One of the reasons The Kindred feels so unsettling is how it treats information as something dangerous rather than empowering. In many horror films, uncovering the truth gives characters leverage. Knowledge becomes a weapon against the threat. Here, the opposite happens. Each new discovery only deepens the sense of inevitability. Learning more doesn't create options, it removes them. The closer characters get to understanding what's happening, the more trapped they become. This inversion quietly undermines a familiar narrative comfort. We're conditioned to believe that clarity leads to control, especially in stories involving science. The Kindred suggests otherwise. Scientific understanding doesn't arrive as enlightenment, it arrives as confirmation that certain boundaries have already been crossed. By the time the truth is visible, it's far too late to undo anything. The film reinforces this idea through pacing. Revelations don't come with dramatic emphasis or triumphant music. They appear almost casually, as if the universe itself is indifferent to whether anyone understands what's happening. This indifference makes the knowledge feel heavy rather than empowering, like a burden that can't be shared or resolved. For viewers, this creates a uniquely oppressive experience. There's no moment where everything clicks into place in a satisfying way. Instead, comprehension feels like complicity. The film quietly asks a disturbing question: if you know something terrible exists but can't stop it, does understanding actually make things worse? The Kindred never answers, but it doesn't need to. 11. Another element that quietly distances The Kindred from mainstream horror is its lack of spectacle-driven escalation. Most genre films build toward bigger, louder, more extreme moments as they progress. This film resists that structure. Instead of increasing intensity through scale, it deepens unease through accumulation. Small, unsettling details stack on top of one another until the atmosphere feels suffocating. This method can be easy to overlook because nothing announces itself as the big moment. Scenes bleed into each other, each leaving behind a residue of discomfort. The horror doesn't spike, it settles. That choice reflects the film's biological themes, where damage often isn't sudden or explosive, but gradual and irreversible. Something goes wrong slowly, then becomes permanent. Audiences conditioned to expect clear peaks and valleys may find this approach frustrating. Without obvious climaxes, the experience can feel flat on first viewing. But that flatness is deceptive. The tension never releases, which means it has nowhere to go but inward. The result is a persistent low-level dread that lingers longer than most overt scares. Over time, this structural choice has proven effective in a quiet way. Viewers often remember how The Kindred made them feel, rather than what specifically happened. That's because the film prioritizes psychological saturation over narrative fireworks. It doesn't overwhelm, it erodes. And erosion, once it begins, is difficult to reverse. 12. The film's obscurity has ironically protected it from becoming dated. Many horror movies from the same era are closely tied to trends, fashions, or cultural anxieties that now feel locked in time. The Kindred, however, exists in a strange limbo. Its themes are specific enough to be unsettling, yet broad enough to remain relevant as scientific conversations evolve. Because it was never widely embraced, the film avoided the kind of overexposure that turns once provocative ideas into cliches. Viewers encountering it today often do so without expectations, making its impact feel surprisingly fresh. Advances in genetics and biotechnology have only sharpened its implications, turning what once seemed speculative into something uncomfortably plausible. This delayed relevance highlights a common pattern with certain films. They don't fail, they arrive early. The Kindred didn't resonate because audiences weren't ready to see science framed without optimism or clear moral guardrails. Progress was still assumed to be fundamentally benevolent. The film quietly questioned that assumption. Seen now, its pessimism feels less extreme and more observant. It doesn't predict catastrophe. It simply refuses to promise safety. And that restraint may be why the film still unsettles. It never insists the future will be terrible. It just suggests it might not be kind. 13. What makes The Kindred particularly uneasy is how little blame it assigns. In many horror narratives, catastrophe can be traced back to a single reckless choice or a clearly immoral character. This film avoids that clarity. Instead, responsibility is diffused across decisions that seem reasonable in isolation. No one action feels monstrous on its own. It's only when those actions accumulate that the horror becomes unavoidable. This diffusion mirrors how real-world scientific and institutional failures often occur. Progress doesn't collapse because of one dramatic error, but through a series of compromises that feel justified at the time. The Kindred captures that process with unsettling precision. Each step forward feels logical, even necessary, until the consequences are impossible to ignore. By then, turning back no longer seems like an option. The absence of a clear villain can be frustrating for viewers searching for moral grounding. There's no cathartic confrontation, no moment where wrongdoing is decisively punished. Instead, the film leaves audiences grappling with a more uncomfortable idea that harm can emerge from systems functioning exactly as intended. That idea strips away the comfort of distance. If no one is explicitly evil, then the problem feels closer to home. This ambiguity may explain why the film never sparked mainstream discussion. It doesn't offer outrage or easy condemnation. It quietly implicates processes, priorities, and assumptions that are harder to attack. The horror isn't about corruption, it's about normalization. And once something becomes normal, it rarely feels urgent until it's too late. 14. The film's visual restraint also extends to its use of space. The Kindred avoids grand or stylized locations, favoring environments that feel functional and impersonal. Rooms resemble laboratories, offices, or storage spaces rather than dramatic sets. This choice grounds the story in places associated with work and procedure, not spectacle. Horror unfolds in spaces designed for efficiency, not emotion. That spatial neutrality reinforces the film's themes. Nothing about the environment signals danger in advance. There are no gothic warnings or exaggerated shadows. The setting doesn't prepare the viewer for fear, it normalizes it. When unsettling events occur in these ordinary spaces, they feel more invasive, as if something private has been violated. This design choice may have dulled the film's immediate impact on release. Audiences often rely on visual cues to anticipate tension, and The Kindred offers few. But over time, that restraint becomes more disturbing. The lack of stylization removes a layer of protection between viewer and subject matter. You're not entering a horror world, you're watching one emerge within familiar surroundings. In retrospect, this approach feels deliberate. The film doesn't want to transport its audience. It wants to displace them. By placing horror in spaces that resemble real workplaces and institutions, it suggests that the most unsettling transformations don't happen in hidden layers. They happen where routine quietly overrides reflection. 15. Perhaps the most unsettling legacy of The Kindred is how quietly it invites comparison to real scientific history. The film never references specific cases, yet its themes echo documented moments where experimentation outpaced ethical consideration. Viewers familiar with those histories may feel an unspoken resonance, even if they can't immediately name it. The horror feels informed, not imagined. This resonance is subtle but powerful. The film doesn't accuse or dramatize real events. It mirrors their structure. Curiosity becomes justification. Success overshadows caution. Consequences are treated as acceptable losses. By avoiding explicit references, The Kindred allows the audience to make their own connections, which can be more disturbing than direct commentary. At the time of release, these parallels may have felt abstract. Today, they feel harder to ignore. As scientific capabilities expand, the questions the film raises seem less hypothetical. What limits should exist? Who enforces them? And what happens when progress moves faster than accountability? The film never answers these questions, and that silence is its final provocation. The Kindred doesn't warn, it observes. It documents a trajectory and leaves viewers to decide whether it's fictional or familiar. That lingering uncertainty may be the film's most enduring effect, quietly challenging anyone who watches it to consider how far is too far and who gets to decide. 16. What's often overlooked about The Kindred is how deliberately it avoids sensationalizing fear. There are moments that could have been pushed into shock territory, lingering close-ups, dramatic reveals, or heightened sound design, but the film consistently pulls back. That restraint isn't accidental. By refusing to amplify its most disturbing elements, the film forces viewers to confront them without emotional cushioning. The absence of excess makes each image feel heavier, not lighter. This choice runs counter to the instincts of most horror filmmaking, where intensity is typically escalated to maintain engagement. The Kindred instead trusts discomfort to do the work on its own. It assumes the audience doesn't need to be convinced something is wrong, they just need time to realize it. That realization often arrives quietly after a scene has already passed, which makes it harder to shake. For many viewers, this delayed impact is what makes the film linger. You don't recoil in the moment. You reflect afterward. The horror sinks in during pauses in the spaces where nothing is happening. That kind of unease isn't easily processed or dismissed because it doesn't follow familiar patterns. In that sense, The Kindred behaves less like a traditional narrative and more like an experience. It doesn't guide reactions, it allows them to form organically. And once they do, they tend to stay. The film doesn't chase fear, it lets fear catch up on its own terms. 17. The film's relationship with its audience is unusually demanding. The Kindred doesn't explain itself, reassure its viewers, or provide emotional signposts. It assumes a level of patience and attentiveness that many genre films simply don't require. This expectation may have alienated casual viewers, but it also defines the film's identity. Watching it feels less like being entertained and more like being observed alongside the characters. This dynamic creates a subtle tension between viewer and film. You're not invited to sympathize easily or escape into fantasy. Instead, you're positioned as a witness, someone present, but powerless. That powerlessness is key. The film doesn't allow the audience to imagine themselves fixing the situation or making better choices. You're locked into observation, just like the camera. For some, this makes the experience uncomfortable in a way that borders on confrontational. Without clear guidance, viewers are forced to supply their own moral framework. Is what's happening wrong? Who is responsible? At what point should something have stopped? The film refuses to answer, leaving those questions unresolved. This unresolved tension is part of why The Kindred doesn't fade easily from memory. It doesn't end a conversation, it starts one internally. Long after viewing, the audience is still processing what they were shown and why it felt so unsettling. The film's true impact unfolds after it's over. 18. Over the years, The Kindred has quietly benefited from changing cultural context. When it was released, its pessimistic view of science felt out of step with mainstream optimism about progress and innovation. Today, that same skepticism feels more familiar. Public conversations around ethics oversight and unintended consequences have become more visible, making the film's themes resonate in ways they once didn't. This shift has altered how the film is perceived by those who rediscover it. What once seemed excessively grim now feels cautious, even restrained. The horror no longer reads as exaggeration, but as speculation grounded in real anxieties. Advances in biotechnology have narrowed the gap between fiction and possibility, lending the film a renewed relevance. Ironically, this relevance hasn't turned The Kindred into a celebrated classic. It remains obscure, discussed quietly, rather than championed loudly. But that obscurity suits it. The film was never designed to reassure or inspire, it was meant to unsettle thoughtfully. Seen through a modern lens, The Kindred feels less like a relic and more like a warning that was ignored. Not because it predicted specific outcomes, but because it understood a pattern. Progress without reflection tends to leave discomfort in its wake. And discomfort, once recognized, is hard to forget. 19. One of the quiet reasons The Kindred continues to unsettle is how resistant it is to reinterpretation. Many older horror films can be reframed as camp nostalgia or stylistic excess once enough time has passed. This one resists that softening. Its imagery doesn't invite ironic distance, and its tone refuses humor or exaggeration. Watching it ironically feels almost inappropriate, as if the film itself discourages detachment. That resistance comes from how grounded everything feels. There's nothing flamboyant to laugh at, nothing stylized enough to dismiss as outdated fantasy. Even the film's limitations, its modest budget, restrained scope, and muted pacing work in its favor. They strip away spectacle and leave only implication. What remains isn't impressive, but invasive. As a result, The Kindred often leaves viewers unsure how to talk about it. It doesn't provide memorable one-liners or iconic set pieces. Instead, it creates a mood that's difficult to articulate, but hard to forget. That ambiguity limits its popularity, but it deepens its effect. Films that inspire clear reactions are easy to categorize. Films that provoke discomfort without release tend to linger. In that sense, The Kindred exists outside the usual life cycle of horror fandom. It's not celebrated, remade, or heavily referenced. It's encountered privately and remembered quietly. And perhaps that's fitting for a film that never wanted attention, only acknowledgement. 20. The final impression. The Kindred leaves isn't fear, but unease rooted in plausibility. By the time the film ends, the horror no longer feels contained within the story. It feels transferable, as though the conditions that created it could exist elsewhere under slightly different circumstances. The film doesn't suggest an isolated anomaly. It suggests a pattern that could repeat. This is where its true power lies. Rather than closing the door on its ideas, the film leaves them ajar. There's no sense that what happened was extraordinary enough to be unique. Instead, it feels like a consequence of priorities left unchecked. That implication lingers longer than any visual shock. At the time of release, audiences may have dismissed this as excessive bleakness. Today it reads as restraint. The film doesn't scream about catastrophe, it quietly outlines how one might occur. That subtlety makes its horror harder to resist, because it doesn't demand belief, it invites recognition. By ending without reassurance, The Kindred completes its most unsettling gesture. It doesn't ask whether science can go too far. It assumes it already has, and leaves the audience to decide whether that assumption feels fictional or uncomfortably familiar. What ultimately makes The Kindred linger is not any single scene image or idea, but the way it refuses to frame its horror as a mistake. Many films about science gone wrong hinge on error, a miscalculation, a reckless shortcut, a moment where someone clearly crosses a line. The Kindred avoids that comfort. Nothing in the film feels accidental. Every step follows logically from the one before it. The horror emerges not from chaos, but from order. This is why the film feels so uncomfortable to revisit. It doesn't present a scenario where things could have gone differently if only someone had made a better choice. Instead, it suggests that given the same priorities, progress, curiosity, efficiency, the outcome was almost inevitable. That implication shifts the film from warning to observation. It isn't asking viewers to fear science itself, but to question the systems that decide how science is used. In that sense, The Kindred doesn't age like fiction. It ages like a case study. As real-world debates around genetic manipulation, medical ethics, and experimentation grow louder, the film feels less speculative and more reflective. It doesn't predict the future, it recognizes a pattern. And once that pattern is seen, it becomes difficult to unsee. So the real discomfort isn't what the film shows. It's what it assumes the audience already understands. If The Kindred unsettled you, ask yourself why. Was it the imagery or the idea that nothing in this story felt impossible? Which fact lingered the longest, and which one felt uncomfortably close to reality? Let us know in the comments. And if there's another forgotten horror film you think deserves this kind of dissection, tell us what we should dig into next.